Hey, hello, Tony.
Hello, Marc.
How are you doing?
Good, good. It's just the two of us today. Um,
Yep,
how are you doing?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, it's gonna be nice to have a little casual chat. First podcast we do solo or duo like this. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah, bit of a special one today. Since it's just the two of us. If anybody in the chat has any questions and stuff, we'll happily take them and discuss those.
yes.
And yeah, that's pretty much it. What's in your mind these days?
Oh man, I have a lot of open questions. So, full disclosure, I love GraphQL and I work with it every day, but I end up working on a lot of the like adjacent stuff, like operations and just like running services, like just everything not GraphQL. Um, So I tend to like daydream a lot about things that could be. I don't get a lot of time to chase them. So I have a lot of like open questions and problems like um, around documentation, like how do you make good documentation for GraphQL, especially when you have a really large API. Um, like I think a lot of companies tend to have large GraphQL APIs after they've really invested. I don't know. How about yourself? Like, have you?
Yeah, no, that's. I think it's a good one. We were chatting right before this. I think like the whole like GraphQL is self-documenting thing that you hear a lot because of the schema is like my
Yeah.
biggest pet peeve ever. Because if you look at like the self-documenting documentations for APIs, it's like always a huge like list of objects and fields and like interfaces and unions. And like if you look at the API and you wonder, I want to do X, you're just like stuck with 1,000 different items you got to put together. And like to be
Yeah.
honest, like people say that's a quality of GraphQL, the documentation part, but to me, like if you were doing that with REST, like just trying to like REST with no effort, I feel is
Hmm.
has just naturally better documentation because it's like things are separated usually by like you want to do this, you've got this resource there, and then
Yeah.
with GraphQL it's nice because like you've got all these parts you can put together, but you need to figure out like the user has to figure out how to put them together for them to make sense.
Right.
So I think it's a problem that's not solved so well these days. How do you do documentation right now? Like, do you need to with an internal API, or like you can kind of get
Yeah.
away with it?
Definitely. Right. Like, so the way we do our API, we try to make like one API for all our clients, and we have a ton of clients like on Twitch TV or mobile web, Apple iOS, so many. And we want to make a schema that's like general enough to be used by everyone, but that means like you're not super prescriptive in what it looks like. So you're kind of like in this weird like level of abstraction where you're saying what the types are, but not really how to use them.
Yeah,
And so it can be like pretty confused. Like I can tell you what it is and what each field is, but I can't really tell you it's intended to be used like this or in this way, or components in this client have been built this way with a query like this. So
yeah,
something that I've been thinking about is so to answer your question, like it's pretty poorly documented.
yeah. It's hard.
um, it tells you the what, but not really like the why. And part of that's by design because you want the flexibility. But I think there's room for something that says like, here's an example of how this was done, or like here's an example of how you would use this. Um, so yeah, I don't know. Something we have Markdown documentation now that we have like a static site generator that we use internally.
Right.
Our API is internal only.
Yeah.
Um, so for these client teams, we want to tell them like, hey, this is all the stuff we have, and this is how you should use it, or this is a way it's been used before. So we were thinking about, or I was thinking about, maybe just like adding some little graphical instances embedded into the static documentation page to at least like say, this is what a channel page looks like in Twitch, and the query looks like this. At least to give enough examples to say, oh, I get it now. This is how the conventions of the API are now. Like I see this is used in this way.
Yeah, kind of
that
like
kind of stuff.
a starting point almost, like this is how you fetch channels. But then if your client has specific needs, then you can like branch off from there, remove some
Yeah,
fields, add some relationships or whatever. But yeah, when you've got like no starting point and you're looking at giant
it could
lists of
be
fields,
overwhelming.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like even like Graphql is great, but if you take like even GitHub's API and use Graphql with it and type like issue, for example, well,
Yeah.
like there's 1,000 things that relate to issues, and
Yeah.
you might find a type called issue, but it still doesn't tell you how to get to that type. And like, so what you're interested in, usually people will point you to the query route because that's kind of like where actual use cases start, but
Right.
that's not always the case, right? Like if you've got like a node field, maybe the use case is to fetch an issue using the node field, and then
Yeah.
and I think that's one cool thing. And I think I really want to get that team on the podcast actually. But the new like Apollo Studio thing, like their own version of Graphql, kind of
Hmm.
has this kind of thing like where given a type, they can tell you like paths to that type, basically like how
Oh,
can
okay.
you get to that, which
Oh, interesting.
I think is pretty interesting. Yeah, it kind of like it
Hmm.
solves a bit of that problem, but it's still automated. I'm not sure if there's
Right.
I'm not sure if you can fix this without human involvement, like having actual
Yeah.
humans like describe use cases.
Yeah, I think the best kind of tooling kind of aids like a technical writer in writing something. So like I think a lot of times as engineers we try to automate everything, but there's still certain things that require human, I don't know, intuition or um,
Absolutely, yeah,
cognition. Yeah, I don't. There's just human stuff that we need to do. But it's better if we automate whatever doesn't need that.
yeah.
Pretty.
That's a
Um,
good point on the tech writers though. Like saying GraphQL is self-documenting and you don't need like it's kind of like a slap in the face to tech writers. Like they're so useful. Like there's a reason
yeah.
why they exist. It's because we need them to like write things that humans can understand and like actual
Yeah.
like documentation that's pleasant to use. Yeah, like
It's
uses
so
the
high
right words.
leverage too.
Yeah,
Yeah. If people can understand what you're actually trying to do, in like I don't know, 10, 100, 1,000, tens of thousands of people read it, like that's huge. That's high leverage. Um,
yep, definitely. One thing I've been thinking about is like, so I think one of the solutions to this is, well, like either manually or some kind of automated way is to describe like, I guess like example queries is good, but even more than that, like describing like a whole feature. Like if I take GitHub, for example, like um, maybe like add like reviewing a PR and like merging it if the reviews are green or something like that's something a lot of people will want to do.
hmm
Um, and the schema doesn't explain how to do like a workflow, right? You've kind of like those
hmm
use cases and workflows being kind of like putting a bunch of use cases or features together. That's something
Right.
I'd really like. And I think there's an opportunity here to like describe that in terms of tests and like have some kind of
Hmm.
automation where you write tests and it ends up in the docs, or the opposite where like you write use cases and features and that's used to like contract test your actual GraphQL API. So that's something I've been
Yeah.
kind of thinking about.
Interesting. Have you ever done? This is actually something we don't do, and I think it's surprising. But like actual just integration tests from just at the API level, and we don't do it because we we've been a really small team in the past, and we have to be pretty pragmatic about where we spend our effort. Integration tests, in my experience, have tend to be a little flakier, and also it doesn't really tell you about anything what the client is experiencing, like the user experience. So like something could be a certain way in the API, and maybe it's not a breaking change, but it breaks the client because they've made some assumption rather than like being in the schema. So like the client integration test can catch it, but just a pure API integration test can't.
That's
Uh,
interesting. Yeah. I guess it depends. Do you mean integration tests as in like fully external to your API test or
yeah, yeah, like you've
like really
spun it
end
up
to
in some
end?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I've never used those actually. Which yeah, we use integration tests like more like not like really end to end, like actually calling the controller within our apps.
Yep.
We use that more than actually like unit tests of the
Okay.
GraphQL resolvers. But
Mm-hmm.
no, yeah, end to end, I kind of agree with you. And then there's a whole like if you've got like permissions and stuff, you gotta
Mm.
like generate the whole like every permutation of that,
Yeah.
and like it's hard, yeah. Which is one thing that makes tests hard because there's so much contextual stuff, as you said, from the client.
Yeah. Yeah. We rely a lot on unit tests. Like we found the mapping between like resolvers and functions to be kind of nice because like you can, they're functions. There's an input, there's an output. So it's unit testable. Unit tests are fast, but then like you don't catch the like end to end. My client expected this this shape or this type or
Yeah.
um yeah, I think it's, but like, I mean, to that point, writing tests as documentation, that seems really nice. I think that's been, I think you have a lot more experience than me in like different APIs than GraphQL. Like you kind of dive into all sorts of APIs.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, a little bit. But you're right. That's been a thing in the past for sure. Um,
yeah, is that contract driven testing? Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So yeah, I feel like there's an opportunity for GraphQL there as well.
Yeah.
We have. I want to answer Patrick PY in a chat has a question.
Nice.
Question about naming things. We have a mutation that's called get something. It is a mutation because it gets something if it exists, but if it doesn't
Hmm.
exist, it creates it. But I feel like it should be a query since it fetches something after all.
Interesting.
That is interesting. I think per the spec, like if a field can have a side effect, it just has to be a mutation.
Yeah.
Because like imagine if you do anything concurrent. I think queries like are fully parallelizable in theory.
Right.
So I think it has to be a mutation, but maybe like the way to make it less confusing is to have that in the name. I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen this kind of functionality described as upsert, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
portmanteau of update and insert. But it seems like maybe there's not any input, or
Oh yeah,
I don't know.
yeah,
That was tricky. I may err on like pattern matching here and just say upsert thing, and it's if it exists, it'll update. If it doesn't exist, it'll insert the record into um, the database. Or I may just call it create. I don't know.
there's in Rails you've got like some helper methods for a database where you do like I think it's find or create or something like
Find or
that.
create.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That could make sense here, like find or create something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in some cases it's not a mutation, but I think that's fine. Like if your mutation doesn't write anything, that's okay.
Yeah.
But if your query writes something, that's not okay. So yeah, I'd still put it on the mutation side, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. I could see this in the context of maybe like a session or something. Like get the session if it exists, if not create one.
Ooh, yeah. Would that be a mutation? I guess.
Hmm.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot of gray area, and I think that's what makes this kind of space like fun and interesting. And the fact that there's also, I think, like not a very correct answer, or you may only learn the correct answer after trying a couple different
Yeah.
things. Um,
Although, like,
but
if you put it on a query side and you've got, like, if your query is executed on, like, concurrently,
yep,
I guess even if it's a session, like, you could, like, start creating a session and then some other field reads it before it's created, like, or you like, create two sessions per mistake,
yeah,
or I guess you kind of have to put it in mutation where fields are
right.
executed sequentially.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I guess the rule of thumb there would be if it's changing something at any time in any like state, you probably want it as a mutation.
Yeah, I remember one thing we struggled with at some point is like a mutation for something like basically triggering the async computation of something.
Hmm.
It's like
Okay.
if you kick off a background job, for example, like is that it enqueues something, so that's kind of like a side effect, but it doesn't
Yeah.
create anything.
Yeah.
So that's a confusing one as well.
Yeah. I've actually seen that. Uh, it for here is like if you have some operation like you want to kick off like a purchase of something and it has to check like stock or whatever. I don't know. Maybe it has to integrate with some external system, some
Right.
things that take a long time. I think it's fair to make that a mutation. Like you're kind of creating, I don't know, the like enqueuing something, um, but waiting in line for something. I don't know, and then you can get a token back that you can pull for updates to the status of that purchase or something. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess like when in doubt, mutations probably
Yeah,
probably
if
safer.
you're changing data, yeah, for sure. Um, that's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. That's a excellent question.
Um, I'm really interested in. Um, I don't know. I feel like there's some good practices. I don't know if I'd call them strong practices. And I think you touch on a lot of these in your book, Mark. I feel like there's some like deeper like truth that we're kind of fumbling around and discovering, at least in the early days, and maybe still now. I feel this way with like subscriptions when I'm thinking about implementing GraphQL subscriptions. It's like, do we create an entirely different schema just for subscriptions and that are limited to like the things that you can ask for as the result of an event, or does it tie into the rest of the schema so that we can compose it? Like,
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's a good one. I've actually never seen any kind of like beginning of convention there. So you know how like mutations, like the pattern has been like having those payload and input types
Yeah,
for them.
yeah,
Um, I haven't seen that on the subscription side, although I haven't seen a lot of schemas with subscriptions so far.
right.
Um, I wonder if that would be a pattern like where you've got like a subscription payload that doesn't
Yeah,
necessarily have access to the entire schema.
yeah. Actually, like that, it makes me wonder, like how. Maybe we could talk about like how we discover what's a good practice and what's not such a good practice. Is it just like a like an iterative process? Like, is it trial and error? Like, do we stop and think really hard before we do? Like, how do you approach these kinds of things where you're kind of just stepping into the unknown?
Yeah, so like it's hard, right? Because for APIs, like you make mistakes are like very costly.
It's
So,
expensive.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I feel like people often complain on like big design upfront being not
Hmm.
so great and like super slow. I agree, like not to go full on like big design upfront and not
Yep.
try things. But for API, like I tend to I tend to be a little bit more on the side of design just because, yeah, like it's not, if you change something in implementation, you can like roll back or revert the change in 1 week and everything's fine.
Hmm.
With
Hmm.
APIs, you don't know how many people started using it, who you're going to have to reach out to. And like,
Very much can take years.
yeah, it can
Speaking from
definitely take
experience.
years. Yeah, there's always
Uh,
like you do a git blame and you realize this thing has been like deprecated for 10 years.
yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like designing a bit upfront is great. But as you said, like there's spaces where best practices haven't emerged yet. Like maybe it's just a question like we haven't made enough mistakes yet to learn, and we'll just like need to wait a few years.
Yeah.
But yeah, the subscription design one is a great question. I haven't looked into it as much I would like to be honest.
Yeah. Same. Like I mentioned at the start of the stream, I spend a lot more time on not the like hard interface problems because there's so much else. Like that's one important facet and it allows you to do so much. But then there's this like whole other thing just with like software engineering in general. There's like you got to build your thing, you got to deploy it, you have to pull in updates. the requirements change all the time. You have to adapt to those.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. The annoying thing about subscriptions, I think I've said that before on a podcast, but like the spec itself is super simple,
yeah.
which is great because you can like, it can work over any kind of transport and everything. But then at the
Hmm.
same time, there's like absolutely no guidance on what powers that like pub sub or subscription system is.
Right.
And I feel like that's a really, really hard part. It's not just like, okay, you subscriptions work this way. You send a subscription query, and magically you get
Yeah.
streaming back. But
Yeah. There's
it's like the owl thing. Like draw the rest of the of the owl.
yeah. Start with a circle, a smaller circle, and then draw the rest of the owl. Exactly that. Um, yeah. It's I think it's pretty elegant at a very high level, and then there's just so many details to figure out and get right, and so many trade-offs, especially as I think the reason why we don't see so many GraphQL subscriptions APIs in the wild is just well, one, I think like um, it's a lot harder to do,
Yeah.
um, and it's also probably there's things you can do in a cheaper way. Um, and I think like not a lot of places or problems have the hard need for like subscriptions, um, given the complexity. So I think a lot of people don't make that trade-off. Um, and I don't even really know when to make it, but um, I would love to work on a big subscription system.
I'd love to
That's
as
about,
well.
yeah.
Looks like a really fun challenge. One of the challenges I have in mind with subscriptions is like, I think we've talked about this before too. Like every, because like the client says what query you want to execute on every event, like
Hmm.
that's so many variations of kind of the same thing to compute
Yes.
on every event. Like it seems very hard to do any kind of caching or like reusing,
Since it's contextual, yep.
which is a problem of GraphQL in general, but it seems like multiplied when it comes to subscriptions because like every event you got to compute just everything for every client.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at. Like maybe if you simplify the schema and like really limit what you can ask for on a subscription, then maybe caching becomes easier. Like maybe it's not contextual stuff based on who asked for it. But then I don't know if that like harms some of the use cases that would be,
Yeah,
you know, helpful.
yeah. I've seen a pattern of like people returning the query root field. I've seen
Okay.
that on mutations,
Huh.
which is interesting because it's like the opposite. It's
Yeah.
everything you do, you can just fetch the world
Huh.
after if you'd like. And I've always
Yeah.
there's good things to it, but at the same time, like even we were talking about documentation earlier, it's like the type doesn't tell you anything about what should be expected if you do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Mm-hmm.
refetch whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Typically, yeah, when I'm thinking about like what do we turn on mutations, I'm trying to scope it as close as I can to the thing that was mutated. And sometimes it's a little bit awkward because the thing that was mutated is like a property of a parent object, and then rather than returning the thing that was, I don't know, like a settings object, you return like the user who owns the settings object. And then it kind of has that problem where you get away from the intended usage, or like you're supposed to fetch the user and then ask for the user settings, and then yeah.
Yeah. It's yeah, like I mean, as you said earlier, like I love GraphQL as well, but there's definitely times where it's like we don't have all the answers, and it's
Yeah.
one of the challenges I've been thinking about is it's like the simple thing with something like REST is because like when you route something somewhere, like somebody fetches like slash org slash repo slash one, you know that usually like most of that information is going to be where you routed it.
Hmm.
But with GraphQL, like even if you have this central GraphQL gateway, like you have,
Yep.
if you let's say take a look at the root field, which is an organization with ID 1,
Hmm.
and you got to route it like I'm thinking in terms of like of sharding or like distributed data, if you route it
Okay.
somewhere, then there's no saying that maybe that org then reaches out for things that are outside of like that silo kind of thing. So
Yeah.
it's the fact GraphQL like just by definition centralizes everything, is makes it really hard in some contexts. And I wish I kind of knew like how Facebook dealt with that.
Yeah.
Like having a huge monolith certainly helps, but I feel like their data must be sharded in some ways where, yeah, just the fact like you
Yeah.
can receive a query that just decides to fetch things from everywhere, and you gotta like
Right.
hop from different places, and like every time you gotta route it to the right place, makes things so much harder than your
Yeah.
typical REST. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. And I think we talked to Dan Schaefer, who was on the original team that ended up proposing GraphQL. It seems like, from my understanding, is that the idea of GraphQL came out of their existing data model. So it was like already like emanated out from that. So that was already doing whatever you needed to do to scale at like Facebook scale. And they just made it look unified because it already looked unified. And I don't know. I've
Right.
not worked at Facebook. I don't. So like I'm just kind of guessing and speculating. But yeah, it seems like the magic sauce is in that data layer that makes it look like it's already this unified thing. I wonder though if that's something that like that data loader can help with. Like maybe it's I don't know, I guess it depends on how isolated you're thinking of these shards. So like say organization Twitch TV is in shard A, organization GitHub is in shard B.
Yeah, I guess like, so if you take a look at Shopify, for example, like their I don't know what it looks like, but I imagine like their sharding model is not simple, but like simpler, because things are by shop. Like you won't, a
Hmm.
shop field will rarely need to look up like products from another shop unless they decide to
Yeah.
do like whatever marketplace thing. Um, but if you think about GitHub, where you have different organizations with repos where there's collaborators from other orgs and like
Yeah.
events that relate to an issue in another repo or something like that.
Yep.
There's no like, you might receive GraphQL queries that span multiple orgs that are in different places eventually and
Right.
stuff. So um, that seems like a hard part, and like that's why we hear so much about that. What did they call it? Like the unified data graph, or like once,
Yeah.
which is great, but at the same time, isn't there like a good thing about like complete separation sometimes? Like I know like you and I have talked about resiliency and like kind of like,
Hmm.
and we talked about with Marc from Yelp about like how they dealt with that. And it seems like we have to accept like GraphQL makes that a bit harder. Like you got to be a bit smarter. Like if one part of it falls down, it's not the
Yeah.
same if one of your resources is down, because like that's the one that hits that part that's down. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think it's a little clear to think of failure in terms of like REST endpoints. Like I can, it's pretty like intuitive. Like I get either okay or not okay, or whatever it is, and all the data can come back or not. I think it's a little bit harder to reason about when you're always getting okay, and part of the response may be there, may not be there. This is something that we're kind of thinking about at Twitch, is like we have this unified thing across all these services. We have a service-oriented architecture with hundreds of services. And we spend a lot, it's a lot of effort to do that. Like there's a lot of operational overhead to run each service,
Right.
and you can have situations where there's more services on a team than engineers, and each one has a fixed cost to operate. But the reason why you do that is so that all these pieces can move independently and fail independently of each other. And then we like kind of unify it, which is fine. That makes it nice to access the data from the client side when you're developing an application. But then the challenge is like, how do you reason about the response on the application side and make it so that you're not rebuilding this like monolithic overly fragile thing. Like how do you handle partial responses? Like what does it mean to get only this part of the response, and maybe like you're on Twitch and your side navigation doesn't load? Like what does that look like? How do we make that part of our like product development process?
Right. So
Um,
like you have to handle that at every layer, as you said, right? Like if your front end can't handle partial failures, that's just
yeah,
as bad if you didn't handle it at the GraphQL layer or in your service layer.
yeah.
Oh, here's somebody in the chat saying Lee talked about this here. Oh, I think we don't accept URLs in the chat. Most of the Facebook schema was auto-generated and the API acted as a gateway. Interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think like there's a lot of benefits from starting with a very strong data layer. I don't know that a lot of places have that kind of benefit. Um, we certainly don't.
Right, like it makes me think, and I've been guilty of this as well, like comparing like the backend for front end pattern with GraphQL.
Hmm.
Um, but the like both can help like multiple clients like kind of like access the representation of data they would like. But the difference is that in an actual backend for front end architecture, like if one of those like backends falls, that's only like one experience that's degraded
Yeah,
or whatever. Um,
right.
with GraphQL, like if GraphQL falls, everything falls, and same for
Hmm.
data modeling. Like with backend for front ends, every backend can have its own user object with its own fields. With GraphQL, like you can, but you have to keep it in mind and like create client specific fields. But even then, you're probably going to share, unless you're really like,
Diligent.
yeah,
Yeah.
really diligent and like creating types for every client, which at this point, like, why are you using GraphQL? So it's kind of like an in between where like you got to keep the schema flexible enough,
Yep.
but still with some core parts. And I find that's really hard.
Yeah. That's like the crux of the challenge. At least in my experience.
Yeah.
Um, Mark, I'm wondering, maybe switching topics, have you been following like the GraphQL Foundation stuff that's been going on recently? I mean, just like keeping up with the project.
A
I'm asking because
little bit.
yeah, I'm in the same way. And there's a in the GraphQL organization, there's a GraphQL over HTTP um, repository that has a bunch of like proposals, working group stuff, RFCs. They actually, I think this is attempting to kind of add a little bit more meat to, and separately from the specification. So we talked that like in GraphQL specification, subscriptions are just basically very hand wavy. Draw the circle and then draw the rest of the owl. This one, there's an open PR that I've been kind of eyeing and following the development of is GraphQL over WebSocket protocol, which is interesting.
Interesting.
And then they also are going into uh, pretty good lengths into just specifying what it looks like over HTTP. I wonder if can I post URLs in the channel? Let's see.
Let's see. I think I've got it though. Oh, looks like it works. Yeah.
Oh, look at that, the superpowers. Um, yeah, so I'm kind of I haven't been able to focus very much on this or participate, but I'm like eyeing this every now and then. I'll pull up my GitHub notifications and check out what's the latest thoughts. I think like this kind of work is super useful and helpful because it kind of, a few people just think really hard about this and then
Yeah. So what does this proposal like kind of explain? Like how to like connect subscriptions over HTTP, or is it like
yeah. So the GraphQL spec doesn't say anything about what a request looks like. It really just says like it could be RPC, it could be XML, like I don't know.
Yep.
So this proposes like, okay, you should have a get endpoint that takes this, these query parameters. You should have a post that has this JSON shape. And then for the WebSocket stuff, it does say like how to getting a call. Well, Sorry about that.
No worries.
Um, uh, so where was I? Lost my train of thought. Oh, for WebSockets.
Yeah.
Yeah. It specifies like the mechanics of like how you connect, how you reconnect, what the keep lives look like, how you initialize the connection, and then how you like create a subscription, how you cancel a subscription. I think this is like pretty foundational stuff, and I think it'll help a lot of people like myself figure out how we actually do this and how we do it right, and then also provide like the framework which we build tooling around that interacts with each other.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about this GraphQL of HTTP as well. Something I've been wanting to see for a while. It's hard because I think, like for example, I think GitHub's API, like you can post queries to it, but if you get the endpoint, you get the IDL back by default. I think we might have fixed that.
Okay.
But I think according to the specification, like you need to be able to handle both, or at least post and then possibly get. I've always wanted to like take this a bit, and maybe that's what they want to do as well. So I've been thinking a lot about like GraphQL and caching.
Mm-hmm.
And like one part of me really wants to have a convention where you send queries over get and you send mutations over post.
Okay, interesting.
Because that would simplify things a lot. Right now, because you can send queries using post, you need like special, whatever HTTP cache you're using or proxies, you need to make sure like they know how to handle, either they understand GraphQL and they know what a mutation is and a query is.
Mm-hmm.
If you just did queries over get, you'd get like caching for free.
Yeah. Okay.
And mutations would work. Yeah, and other things like status codes is, we've talked like about this, I think, with somebody from Apollo before, but like status codes are weird because GraphQL uses 200 for just everything. But would it be worth to explore kind of like using HTTP a bit more semantically in some cases? My example is always like 429 rate limited. Right now, different APIs will return like a GraphQL error, and they'll have their own internal code for rate limited. So if you plug in your Apollo client, for example, to GitHub's API or Shopify's API, you'll need to like, the user is going to need to handle the rate limit code or whatever that's exposed.
And it's not documented because all we know is the type is a, I don't know, like a number.
Right, exactly. Or like, even if it's like amazing, it's like well documented, it's probably not handled the same way as this other GraphQL API does it, right? So you can't actually write like a middleware for Apollo client or something that handles that generically, which is one thing that's absolutely great about usual like REST client or HTTP client. There's so many conventions that have been there for like years. So like for example, there's like I was playing with a Ruby client called Faraday for HTTP, and like you've got middlewares for just everything, like even like deprecation headers with like you can log when something gets deprecated, rate limits, like retries, timeouts, and like all these things with GraphQL are kind of like redone for every new API. So I wonder how far like we can use HTTP in GraphQL, because at some point like you have the partial response problem where it can be a success and an error.
I wonder if these kinds of things could be specified. I wonder if the GraphQL organization would be, or foundation, the GraphQL Foundation. Is that the right term?
The what?
The GraphQL Foundation or organization?
Oh, right.
Foundation, I
think.
Foundation. Yeah. I wonder if they would think it's in their scope to define these things. Like, this is what rate limiting looks like as a standard shape. This is what tracing looks like as a standard shape. All these common concerns that everyone kind of does differently now. And part of this might be we're still like in the super early days of this as an API. Like REST is, I think it was proposed in like 2000.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So it's pretty mature, like especially in comparison to something that's like less than half the age.
Do you feel like What do you feel about the pace of like not innovation, but just like the pace of maturity for GraphQL? Do you have a feeling like I had a feeling like initially it was growing like super super fast. My
Yeah,
feeling is that I don't see kind of the same speed anymore, which might be totally normal. I
yeah.
um, like how do you feel about that? Do you have a pulse of on improvements and stuff, or maybe it's just like me, just like you. I've been focusing a lot on like other operation stuff and not necessarily like looking at the every single new thing. But my feeling is like we're in a pretty stable phase.
Yeah, I think like part of that's probably by design. Like I think the spec moves pretty slow, and I think that's great. As far as like development in the area, I wonder if like we're at a time where we got like 80% of the benefit out, and the other 20% is requiring like a lot of effort. So it's either moving slowly or maybe yeah, just get people are getting caught up in other things. Um, I know like for us, a lot of these problems are solved in a good enough fashion. It's like not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it works, and it's kind of harder to justify continued investment into it because it works.
Yeah,
Um, I think my gut would be that a lot of people are in that situation, or a lot of the people that were really early in the GraphQL community, I think maybe have like peeled off a little bit and working on other things. I think it's pretty natural for people to switch their focus. I think maybe there's a few like weird nerds that are still talking about it years later, like myself.
makes sense. Yeah.
I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, at least there's more like the fact we had like there's a foundation and like people working on RFCs and stuff is really cool. That gives it a drive. I know like um, I know I've been seeing a lot of improvements around like graphical and stuff. I know
Yeah.
the foundation has been working on this a lot. Have you seen like kind of like the Graphql Foundation has this Graphql landscape thing,
Ah.
which is kind of like a this image
Whoa.
that talks about like various GraphQL related things.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's a big landscape.
yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah. I think this is like I've seen this type of thing before on shoot, I can't recall. I think it had to do with like tracing or something, or like Open Foundation or something.
Right. I think anything that's like the Linux Foundation
Yeah,
has these little like diagrams.
it's pretty complicated. I don't really
It
know what it's
is.
trying to say.
And I
But
think
I think what I was trying to say is like there's a lot of stuff here.
there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, lots of
Dig
companies,
in.
databases. That's another funny thing to me. Like we're seeing like at this point, there's almost more databases using GraphQL than like API related services using
Yeah,
GraphQL, which is funny to me.
it is really interesting because I would never have thought I've never have thought to do that. Like to me, it's very much an API technology, and you don't want it in your database or your implementation. Like you want to keep those things separate so that they can change separately. I think it becomes really hard if you pipe it all the way through to, I don't know, improve the performance of things or change the shape or I don't know.
Yeah,
We've
same.
done like pretty big migrations under the hood of our GraphQL API at Twitch, and no one noticed. I don't think it would be very easy to do that if it was GraphQL all the way down.
That's the nicest feeling, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
you do a huge migration.
Flip the switch. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure we're doing like a migration or two now. And like, yeah, if that's the weird thing about like API work. If no one notices, you're doing a great job.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so true. Yeah, working in the shadows.
yeah. Um,
Yeah, the thing I'm wondering is like there's some of these databases that are like claiming to be both like an API and like the database. What I'm wondering is
mhm.
like, are there databases using the GraphQL query language, but telling you like don't use that as an API, like actually use that in place of
Ah,
SQL, which I think maybe
interesting.
some of them do. Um,
Hmm.
it's interesting. Like I never would have thought GraphQL would have been kind of like a nicer language than SQL for that.
Yeah.
Um,
SQL's pretty gnarly, and like being in the API land for so long, I've not written since we talked to services. I've not written any SQL queries, but I feel like SQL queries are typically like something you kind of just like write once and maybe optimize, like explain it a few times if it gets slow. I don't know.
but I feel like if you want the same power from a GraphQL query, you'll need to implement a schema that's pretty gnarly as well, right? Like
Yeah,
if you want your
right,
GraphQL queries to be able to do joins,
right, right.
and a bunch of stuff. So yeah, it's a weird area for sure.
Oh man, it's really cool seeing the landscape and kind of things mature. I mean, maybe it's good that things aren't like super breaking every other day. Um, I think it's a curse and a blessing. Like, I think React still ships pretty on the front end. They still ship pretty fundamental changes.
That's what my
That can be
Twitter feed
annoying.
tells me.
Yeah, I know, same. I think my theory now is that for a lot of people, most people that would use it, it's kind of like good enough, and you can like solve that problem and then move on to do other things that are higher priority.
Yeah, I feel like so if you're starting like a SaaS today, your startup, like would you bootstrap like a GraphQL server initially? Would that be your choice?
Personally, I would because I know GraphQL very well. I think if I didn't know it, it may be a lot to dive into for something that, if say you have one consumer, like it's just your website and you're just rendering, I don't know, HTML, or even you're doing a single page app. REST may be easier. Just because of my overall comfort level, like I think now that I know it, it's like I'm not gonna unknow it. Like
Yeah.
I know all the considerations to make. I know what not to do. I don't know. How about yourself?
I wonder sometimes.
You really miss the caching, huh?
Yeah, I mean, like that's one part of it. Like people's, like I hate when people say like you can't do GraphQL caching and GraphQL sucks because of that, because that's not entirely true. But there is like some truth behind that
Yeah.
in certain use cases.
Yeah.
Like if you're dealing, so if I had like a public API that deals, so there's I think somebody made like a GraphQL example that's a GraphQL API for countries.
Okay.
You can fetch like all countries and stuff, and I find like
Yeah.
that's the best example of where GraphQL like provides you with almost no
Very low value.
advantages. Like it's
Yeah.
all public data that you can cache forever.
Right.
Stuff that doesn't change often. It's things you don't really need to customize. So like that's one example. I think it just, yeah, I think the big question, and that's a debate, is I agree totally, like at Facebook scale with Facebook problems, and even like GitHub scale with GitHub's problems, definitely I think that's worth it.
Yeah.
But then I guess the debate is like, if you're starting something, should you start right away with that? Like getting started with REST with most languages and frameworks is incredibly easy. Do you feel like we're at that point with the GraphQL ecosystem? Like you're using Go mainly, is that right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and there's libraries in Go that you can like write your schema and then generate it, or you can like glue your types in and just generate all the code.
Yep,
And that makes it easier to start with.
that's true.
I think it's nice, but I don't know that I would do it if I wasn't like very extremely familiar with the space.
Right.
And also like we didn't choose GraphQL because it was new or anything, or that like people were doing it. It solved a very real problem that we had. So I think it's maybe the thing that I would hesitate with is like, do we have a problem that this is the solution for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like there's two things that are really nice about GraphQL. One of those things is like inherent qualities of GraphQL that like you needed GraphQL for, right? Like when you have multiple clients and you need that flexibility, then
Yeah.
there's no debate. It's great. But then I see some people using it with only one client, and I feel like the inherent qualities of GraphQL aren't that useful for a single
Yeah.
client. But then you could say like, I'm planning for the future, or something, which is fine.
You could.
But then
Right.
there's also the fact that just GraphQL brings a lot of like, it brings a lot of cool things as one package, like the fact your responses are typed. You can do it with REST as well, but I'm not sure if that part is as easy as when you just get GraphQL as a whole. Like you just can't do GraphQL without a schema, which is great.
Right.
And I think that's one part people love
Yeah.
a ton on the front end. Even though you could do it with not GraphQL, you could have like TypeScript from JSON schema or whatever. It just there's no convention for that, and GraphQL just like gives it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if the tooling continues to improve and we specify some of these things that are left unspecified, at least not part of the actual GraphQL specification, but kind of the universe around it, that might help make it a lot easier to like put it more on the rails. Like I feel like we don't have the Ruby on Rails for GraphQL right now.
Right. And that's something.
I know there's a lot of.
Go for it.
I think a lot of people are trying to do that to some extent, but I don't know that there's like that killer implementation that says, this is how this will cover 80% of use cases, no problem.
Agreed. And like that's something Nick Schrock, one of the co-creators of GraphQL, I've heard him say that many times. Like we need a framework that makes like building a GraphQL API just really easy and like have all the best practices. I feel like we don't exactly have that. GraphQL Ruby actually is getting pretty close to that on the Ruby side. Like you've got a lot of good conventions built in. It's really easy to use. I guess like JS always has that problem of like everything is very modular. You can like mix and match things, so it's always like many questions before you get something working.
You can bring in your left pad library. You can bring your right pad library.
I guess Go has a bit of that philosophy as well, where like you don't want to bring in like extra stuff all the time, or like
I think the Go ethos is like it's better to copy something than to take a dependency on it if it's small enough.
Which is true. It's very nice.
I mean, I hope the ecosystem will improve. I think it's getting more expensive to improve. Like I think a lot of the easy wins have been won, and a lot of the other stuff will kind of take a lot more squeeze to juice.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think you're right. I think like everybody can get a decent GraphQL server working these days, but then it's going to be harder to like have something as like something like Rails for GraphQL would be great. I think that's a good ending point for today. We've been going for an hour now. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. Any shout outs?
Shout outs for me?
Yeah.
Shout out to the cold weather. Thank you for returning to San Francisco. We missed you, Fog, and I love you.
I'm gonna say,
how about yourself?
Damn you, Canada cold.
Damn.
That's pretty much it. All right.
Nice.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, Marc.
See ya.